John Kinslen was eating breakfast when the monsters came. They burst through his kitchen door, mouths dripping fire, claws tearing at the air. He scrambled upstairs and threw himself from a second-story window, arms windmilling against invisible flames. His neighbors found him in the garden, bones broken, still screaming about the burning. He was not alone. Within hours, dozens more were tearing through the streets of Pont Esprit. A woman clawed at her own skin, convinced it was melting off her bones. A young man shrieked that serpents coiled up his legs. The village square became a chorus of delirium. Local doctors rushed from house to house, and what they saw stopped them cold. These people were not merely frightened. Their pupils were pinned, temperatures spiking, bodies convulsing with a violence no simple panic could explain. Something was hunting this town, moving through minds like flame, through dry grass. What could make an entire town lose its grip on reality in a single week? Leon Armunier woke on August 16th, convinced his bed was dissolving into snakes. He ran barefoot through the streets of Pont Saint-Esprit, screaming for someone to burn the creatures off his skin. His neighbors tried to hold him down. Then they started scratching at their own arms. By noon, the village square had become something from a fever dream. A baker's wife clawed at her own face. Insisting spiders poured from her eyes. 3 teenagers collapsed in the church doorway, shrieking that the stone saints had come alive to judge them. Their bodies arched backward, heels drumming the cobblestones. Dr. Albert Gabai reached the hospital by mid-afternoon and found every cot occupied, patients strapped down with leather belts, orderlies weeping in the corridors. A middle-aged man sat rigid, eyes fixed on the ceiling, swatting at hornets only he could see. A mother clutched her children and wept that monsters breathed fire through the walls. Their skin burned to the touch, hearts hammered at twice normal speed. Some vomited until they bled. Others seized so hard they bit through their own tongues. Gabai recorded it all through the night. The hallucinations were not random terrors, but shared visions, as if the same nightmare had been planted in every mind. By the third day, more than 200 souls had been struck down. At least 5 were dead. Priests came to pray, police barred the roads, and still no one knew what weapon had been turned against them. The first investigators drove in from Marseille before dawn, their field kits rattling in the trunk. They had a list of what to fear. Chemical warfare agents topped it. The Cold War had begun, and Europe was tense. They swabbed door handles and dipped strips into well water, waiting for nerve gas residue to bloom. Nothing. They tested for blister agents, for compounds that could sear skin and unhinge minds. Still nothing. Mercury poisoning came next. That old killer could explain the tremors, the madness. But mercury left a metallic signature in blood and urine. The victims showed none. So someone proposed mass hysteria, a panic that spread like rumor through a frightened village. Yet hysteria does not make skin burn. It does not stop hearts mid-beat or lock limbs in convulsion. The symptoms were too physical, too uniform, too cruel. Investigators mapped the cases house by house, searching for any pattern the others had missed. The sick were not clustered by neighborhood. They did not share a water source or a church or a market stall. Days passed. More collapsed. The investigators worked through the nights, ruling out each theory with cold precision. And each dead end left them staring at a darker possibility. If not a weapon or a water supply, what common thread connected the victims? The investigators carried notebooks and one question into every kitchen. What did you eat? They wrote down each meal, each ingredient, each sauce, soup from the market, cheese from the neighbor, wine from the cellar. The pages filled. Then a clerk stopped turning them. A single bakery. Every sick household bought their daily bread there. Not most, everyone. The healthy families, other bakers, home ovens. The pattern was almost too simple. A loaf of bread, the most ordinary thing in any French village, pulled warm each morning, torn at lunch, sopped in soup at dinner. Now it looked like a weapon. The investigators converged on the shop. Its flour came from one mill. Its rye threaded through every nightmare, every burning hallucination, every body on the floor. The danger had not drifted through air or seeped from ground. It had been carried inside, sliced, buttered, eaten. But bread is flour and water and salt, nothing more. So what hidden poison could bake inside something so plain? The flour samples came back from Marseille with photographs clipped to the reports. Dark purple-black specks, hard as peppercorns, scattered through the pale rye. The chemists called them sclerotia, fruiting bodies of Claviceps purpurea, a fungus that infects grain and replaces the seed with its own compacted flesh. Inside each speck lay alkaloids that could squeeze blood vessels shut and scramble the brain's chemistry into chaos. Then someone pulled the medical archives. Medieval chronicles described whole villages seized by burning limbs, visions of demons, the conviction their bodies were on fire. Monks of the Order of St. Anthony had built hospitals for these sufferers. The disease had a name from that darker age: St. Anthony's fire. The same black specks in rye, the same convulsions, the same hallucinations, the same deaths. Pont Esprit was not a new puzzle. It was an old nightmare sleeping in the grain, waiting for a wet season and a miller's inattention. But a speck of fungus is barely visible. How does something so small build hallucinations violent enough to drive a man through a window? The answer sits at the molecular scale. Ergotamine and its chemical cousins slip into the body like lockpicks. They wedge into serotonin receptors, dopamine channels, adrenergic docking points, the machinery that governs mood, perception, and the body's sense of its own boundaries. The brain begins receiving signals that are not there. Fire crawls across skin that is not burning. Shapes emerge from empty corners. The compounds also squeeze blood vessels tight, starving tissue of oxygen, so the burning becomes physically real as flesh dies. Gangrene follows. The alkaloids are remarkably tough. Heat from baking does not break them. They ride intact through the oven and into the stomach, then cross into the bloodstream and march for the nervous system. A single loaf could carry enough to poison dozens. The body turns on itself, its own chemistry weaponized by a fungus that needed only a damp field and rye to manufacture this arsenal. The investigators had found their culprit, but knowing the poison and stopping the damage are different wars. The bread was pulled from tables. What came after, for the baker, for the survivors, for a village that had eaten madness, was only beginning. The ovens went cold. The implicated bakery shut its doors. Within days, no new cases appeared. The village exhaled. But recovery was slow and uneven. Some survivors walked home from the hospital and never spoke of the visions again. Others couldn't sleep without seeing the fire-breathing shapes return. A few stayed institutionalized, their minds unmoored by a chemical assault their brains couldn't forget. At least 5 people never recovered at all. The tragedy forced French authorities to tighten grain inspection standards. Mills began checking rye for the dark, horn-shaped ergot bodies that Claviceps purpurea leaves behind. For the first time in centuries, a modern nation treated ergotism as a present danger, not a medieval ghost. Yet the fungus never left. It still infects rye and wheat across damp fields in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The right combination of cool spring rains and delayed harvest can let it bloom again. Silent and patient, a factory for madness waiting in plain sight. The village healed. The world moved on. But the threat didn't retire. It only slept. And somewhere tonight, in a field wet with rain, the next crop is growing. The investigators closed their files with a name that meant nothing: ergotism, a poisoning caused by a fungus, no larger than a grain of rice. Claviceps purpurea had manufactured chemicals to squeeze blood vessels, scramble brains, and tear reality apart for 250 people. The same pathogen medieval monks once fought as St. Anthony's fire had simply waited out the centuries, unchanged, until damp weather and a single bakery gave it passage again. Every symptom, every hallucination, every death traced back to one loaf from one batch of flour. Medieval horrors do not stay in manuscripts. They live in fields, in grain silos, in the gap between harvest and inspection. A black sclerotium, no bigger than a fingernail, still nests among golden rye in damp summers across Europe, Asia, the Americas. Calm, ancient, full of chemistry that can unmake a mind. If something so small can hide in plain sight for 1,000 years, what else might be waiting in the biology we barely notice?